to welcome Eric Laursen to come speak. And Eric has just written an amazing biography called Polymath about Dr. Comfort, who wrote The Joy of Sex. And I'm reading a lot of Havelock Ellis and early 20th century sexological textbooks because I'm writing about Gene Kronsky. And so I'm learning so much, and the narrative is, it means so much to me because it's like a narrative biography, and I'm writing a biography too. And so I really appreciate your writing, and I encourage everyone to check it out.
Okay, thanks, Adrienne. I appreciate that. I was earlier on this morning, Bill outed me as an anarchist, so I anticipated something like this, so I did wear my Antifa t-shirt today. No pasaran. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have this. But Bill is keeping a tight rein on the timetable, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm delighted to be helping to answer the question whether Henry Miller is relevant today. I think if we're going to come up with an answer, there's another question we might want to answer first, which is, how is our world similar to the one Miller wrote about? If he were alive today, would he still feel he had to write the way he did nearly a century ago, or not? So I want to tackle that, but before I get to it, I should say quickly why I'm here to talk about this. I read a lot of Miller years ago, before and during the time that my partner, Mary Dearborn, was writing her biography of Miller, and I helped her research the book. About 15 years later, I wrote a piece for Nexus titled Nirvana Needed: The Anarchist Politics of Henry Miller, in which I tried to show that while Miller was not a politically active person per se, he had a politics that was informed by his exposure to the working class left-wing political culture that flourished in New York in the early 20th century, built around labor organizing, night classes by left-wing lecturers, and rallies and speeches by the likes of Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and John Coper Poes. In other words, Miller was temperamentally and sometimes explicitly an anarchist and a pacifist. FYI, the main Miller texts I referenced in that piece were Max, Black Spring, Murder the Murderer, The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, and The Books in My Life. I also tried to show that George Orwell's conclusion in his famous essay, Inside the Whale, that Miller was, quote, a completely negative, unconstructive, amoral writer, was wrong. Miller was never just blankly observing a rotting Western civilization he didn't accept and adopt a species of quietism, as Orwell says. He had a moral center grounded in the critical view of capitalism and the state that he'd absorbed in his earlier years. Orwell can't be blamed completely for getting this wrong, because the only books of Miller's that he'd read at the time, we're talking 1938, were Tropic of Cancer, Black Spring, and Max and the White Phagocytes, and none of those said a lot explicitly about Miller's politics. So Orwell was writing about Miller before the war broke out and was undecided about his own political stance. Orwell was undecided about his political stance, which is why he found Miller such a fascinating and attractive figure. But I think his view of Miller as a purely apolitical person, which has persisted, was wrong. A few years after I wrote that piece for Nexus, I started researching a biography of Alex Comfort, author of The Joy of Sex, who was also a British poet, novelist, biologist, anarchist political theorist, pacifist, and anti-nuclear activist. It was published in 2023 under the title Polymath. My research turned up a correspondence between Comfort and Miller in the 40s, and a lot of overlap in their literary lives. Comfort was a friend and Cambridge University classmate of the poet Nicholas Moore, who edited a magazine called Seven before the war that had published Miller, Anais Nin, Lawrence Durrell, and other writers who were associated with Miller. Comfort published some of his key anti-war writings during World War II in a journal called Now, which was edited by George Woodcock in the UK. It was an explicitly anarchist political journal, and which it also published Miller, Durrell, Kenneth Rexroth, among others. Miller offered to try to get Comfort's anti-war essay, October 1944, published in the US, and he put him in touch with George Light, the publisher of Circle magazine in Berkeley, which then published 3 of Comfort's short stories. And he referred Comfort to Caress Crosby, who published Comfort in her literary journal Portfolio. The overlaps continued into the 40s. Beyond the 40s rather, Panther Press, the house that published the best-selling paperback edition of The Joy of Sex in the UK in the 70s, had previously been the first above-ground publisher in the UK to bring out Miller's Paris books 10 years earlier. And Grove Press, which published the Paris books in the US in the early 60s, considered publishing The Joy of Sex 10 years later, but chickened out. And of course, both Comfort and Miller were stereotyped as sex writers and quasi-sex gurus, even though sex is only one part of their focus, and this has led to some distorted views of their intentions and their accomplishments. But there were deeper connections between the two, and their politics. Both Miller and Comfort were formulating a kind of anarchist strategy of victory by evasion and survival, as Woodcock put it, a quiet insurgency of non-cooperation and persistence that could outlive the wreckage that capitalism and the state were sure to lead to. Both were close to Rexroth and Kenneth Patchen, and both took a great interest in Indian or Vedic philosophy at various times. Comfort later on was the first English translator of the Koka Shastra, which is one of the most famous Indian erotic texts outside of the Kama Sutra. Both had a kind of a frenemyship with Orwell, who liked Miller's writings but didn't care for what he perceived as Miller's lack of political engagement. And likewise, Orwell admired Comfort's poetry, but attacked him in print for taking a pacifist stand during World War II. More importantly, Miller and Comfort were both part of a loose transatlantic literary and artistic movement that came together briefly during and after the war and helped assemble the pieces of the counterculture that blossomed with the Beats and then in the cultural and political explosion of the 60s. In Britain, this movement was called the New Romanticism, and Comfort was one of its chief ideologues. In an important essay titled Art and Social Responsibility, Comfort laid out the essence of Romanticism as, quote, the acceptance of a sense of tragedy derived from the knowledge of death. And that, of course, is something that Miller wrote about quite a bit as well in the 30s in the Hamlet letters. According to Comfort, art is the ultimate protest against death, the only way that humans can achieve a form of permanence. Orwell complained that writers like Miller and Comfort were oblivious to the dangers of fascism, but Comfort addressed this as well. All too often, he argued, people attempt to deny or negate death by subsuming themselves in society or in the state, which compels them either through subtlety or violence to do their will. Fascism is an example of this. It's the attempt, Comfort wrote, to summate the destructive impulses and use them as a basis for society. It teaches logically contempt for death and suffering in oneself and in others. It teaches that the individual is unreal, and therefore death, the termination of the individual, is unreal also. Something like this anarchist stance was coming together in the US too, among writers including Miller, Rexroth, Patchen, Dwight MacDonald, Elizabeth Smart, and Robert Duncan. What brought the New Romantics in the UK and these radical bohemians in the US together was that all were reacting to some extent against the high modernists and the post-Eliot group of poets, Auden, Stephen Spender, Lewis MacNeice in the UK, all came of age in the run-up to World War II, and all were clustered around a slew of little magazines with little capital and relatively modest readerships. Some were more sexually explicit in their writing, and all were influenced culturally and politically by anarchism and pacifism rather than Marxism, which the Auden group was more influenced by. All advocated neither violent revolution nor liberal democracy, but that the realistic radical alternative should concern itself with building up the nucleus of a new society within the shell of the old. While most of these writers were younger, each group included an esteemed older writer, Herbert Reed in Britain and Henry Miller in the United States. If you want to find out more about this neglected but very influential transatlantic movement or set of movements, I highly recommend James Gifford's book, Personal Modernisms, Anarchist Networks and the Later Avant-Gardes, which came out in 2014. But now that we've established a context in literary culture for Miller, I want to use the rest of my time to suggest that it gives us a different way to read Miller himself. And I realized this morning that this part of my talk is actually a bit of a follow-on to Carolyn's excellent presentation earlier. In preparing for this conference, I've reread a good deal of Miller, and so I've had to come to terms again with both the good and the bad in his work. The attitude of his narrator in Tropic of Cancer and some of his other major works towards women is as bad as I remembered it, and the anti-Semitism that crops up so often in these books is still appalling. But I also found myself reading Miller differently, especially Tropic of Cancer, which is still his most famous book. Orwell called Tropic of Cancer autobiography in the form of a novel, and claimed wrongly, I think, that Miller said that it was straight autobiography. This would imply that the protagonist and the narrator of the book is Miller, and that the attitudes he displays are exactly Miller's attitudes rather than a role he might be adopting. I don't agree, and I now think that this book really should be read straightforwardly as a novel, even if it includes autobiographical elements. I also think that it can and should be read, at least in part, as an American social novel of the Depression years, and that it should be read or can be read alongside such works as Thieves Like Us by Edward Anderson, Jews Without Money by Michael Gold, They Shoot Horses That Don't They by Horace McCoy, and Somebody in Boots by Nelson Algren. The fact that it takes place in Paris instead of somewhere in America makes no difference in this respect. Miller's Paris is a very different one from the Paris that Hemingway and Fitzgerald turned into literature, and more realistic. In the interwar years, the City of Lights was full of impoverished refugees washed up there following the chaotic end of World War I. Miller and Orwell were among the few writers who described this milieu for English language audiences. Tropic of Cancer gives us the homeless who sleep under bridges, but also this very diverse constellation of stateless people without identity papers, who couldn't work or earn a living legally, who were preyed upon by thugs, swindlers, and the police, who had nowhere to go and literally didn't have permission from the state to exist, and were focus of great hostility from right-wing politicians. Does that sound familiar? Like the other social novelists, Miller uncovers some really nasty, revolting aspects of modern society, sometimes in a matter-of-fact reportorial way. The difference is Miller's attitude towards this material. Tropic of Cancer isn't angry the way the other social novels are. It's funny. A lot of the time, Miller seems to revel in how awful the world is and how low people can sink, including his narrator. He finds it all horrible, but he also finds it absurd, even exhilarating, which allows him, the author, not the narrator, to detach and possibly contemplate another way to be. But from that vantage point, what is Tropic of Cancer trying to show us? I think it shows us something similar to the other social novels, which is to expose the way capitalism and the reduction of everything to money permeates every aspect of our existence in modern society. But at the same time, it does something different, which is to demonstrate how capitalism and money don't just impoverish and degrade us, but they turn us into caricatures of ourselves, caricatures of human beings. Miller's narrator lives in a grimly gleeful way outside the money economy. He gets by on handouts, appeals to humanity, meals supplied by friends, casual work, and not much else. He sleeps in flop houses, under bridges, and his actions and reactions, his efforts to keep a few francs in his pockets, expose over and over the violence, absurdity, and cruelty of the system he's skirting, and above all, the lack of empathy it breeds. In one short section, the one that begins, "Paris is like a whore," he one night encounters two women who want money from him and perhaps something else. One he meets in the rain on the Boulevard Raspail. "Oh, my good sir," she says, "do you speak English by chance? Perhaps, my dear good sir, you would be so kind as to take me to a cafe. You will excuse me, my dear sir, you have such a kind face. I knew you were English right away." He takes her to a cafe and she asks for a loan of 15 or 20 francs. She kisses his hand. She's afraid, her papers aren't in order. "I felt like giving her every damn thing I had," he says. He gives her 50 francs, and I thought to myself, it's good to be rich once in a while just to get a new thrill like that. The next woman he meets, a midwife, she says, he meets in a dance hall. She too is in difficulties. She's just buried her child, her mother is very ill, and there's no money for the doctor or medicine. He tells her how much he has in his pocket. She declares herself insulted, but they go to her hotel. "Mama is downstairs and is going to die," she says, and he gives her more money. He sees her midwife's diploma with first class printed on it. They have sex, and she hurriedly goes downstairs, ostensibly to see Mama, or is it her pimp? He fumbles in her purse, steals back the 100 francs he'd given her, and all the loose change he can find, takes off and sits down in a cafe. Quote, "The din around me was increasing, and I had difficulty to recall exactly whether I had seen first class on her diploma or not. It bothered me. About her mother, I couldn't give a damn. I hoped she had croaked by now. It would be strange if what she said were true. It would be strange, but what if it was true?" I think what Miller, not the narrator, is asking us here is to notice the empathy in ourselves, to see how close it is to disappearing and to experience the unease this provokes. What if the first woman really was without papers? What if the second woman really was a first-class midwife? That would make her a person, not just another one of the multitude with a sad story to peddle, or fodder for a tearjerker story from someone like Miller. The story of these two encounters is partly about the absurdity of the situation, sex for money, and the furious way in which the two women play the game, the hustle, to the point where we think there's something wrong with them in the head, or with all of us. Again and again in the sordid stories Miller tells us in Tropic of Cancer, there's this underlying ease with our ability to live with these stories. In Max, Miller's magnificent story about a stateless Jewish refugee in Paris, once again without the all-important identity papers and work permit, and the complicated range of emotional and intellectual responses he provokes in the writer, empathy comes to the surface frighteningly. Max is a vagrant, penniless, uprooted from his place of birth, roaming about a big modern city where he has no friends, no work, no legal identity. Quote, "He was unemployment, he was hunger, he was misery, he was woe, he was despair, he was defeat, he was humiliation," Miller writes. You can feel for him, be annoyed by him, patronize him, want him urgently to get away, but, quote, "Max is in the blood, he is a disease." Now, note that word disease. Miller's premise here is that while empathy is, as good as it sounds on paper, is actually a very dark thing. It's a curse that gets activated when we meet someone whose experience is very different from ours, but at the same time is too close for comfort, so to speak. We want to distance ourselves from them, but we cannot because they're part of us now. In the story of the two women in Tropic of Cancer, the narrator can distance himself from them, adopt a hard shell, but it doesn't entirely work. In Max, it doesn't work at all. Do I have another minute or so? Sure. Okay, all right. All right, great. What Max wants most, the writer realizes, even more than the money to go to America and search for his sister, who he thinks lives in Coney Island, is to be seen, for the dignity of his humanness to be acknowledged. This is really what everyone wants in the modern city with its commodities in such abundance that there's no work for the starving, to be seen. The difference between Tropic of Cancer and Max is that the former is full of people desperately playing the game that capitalism compels them to play, while Max's focuses on one person whose circumstances render him utterly incapable of playing the game, What's comic in the novel here becomes terrifying. These stories about the two women about Max aren't that different from the stories told by the other social realist novelists I mentioned earlier, but generally in the works of Algren or Gold or Anderson, there's a distance. The protagonist or the narrator reports on the other characters and asks us to pity them or be angry over their plight, but seldom recognizes them as in the blood. In Miller, there's more tension. These hapless, exploited, desperate people make us deeply anxious because they are part of us. We could be them. If they're absurd, so are we. And they're everywhere but nowhere, as Carolyn put it this morning. So is Miller still relevant? I would say that at a time when a public figure like Elon Musk can get away with telling people that empathy is bad and that it can and should be rejected just like that, I think we need to listen more carefully than ever to what Miller has to say about this very complex and vital part of our humanity. Thank you.